It's 2008, the anime DVD market is crashing and only a few will really top the box office. The days where you could sell 1 million videos for a title like Ghost in the Shell were going away, which makes an anime movie like this all the more curious, aimed at a young adult audience. It's science fiction but a meditation on war, and it really focuses on the animation with its own unique style. The Skycrawlers. The director commanded, "This has to succeed or else. Or else what? I will quit." Did he really say that? Skycrawlers was a popular book series in Japan, and the author was a fan of director Oshii's work. IG producers pitched the adaptation to the director, but as Oshii read the novel on the train home, he wasn't so sure. A story about young people full of edgy dogfights? I don't know if I can pull that off. So he rejected it, but then he looked at his wallet again, and suddenly had a change of heart. After this last movie, the director was left near penniless. And for years he'd been making movies about middle-aged guys with layers of monologues and cerebral tones. People around him thought he'd just do that forever. Yet he wanted to make a change. The director felt like a new man, and thus wanted to try a different approach. After all, to make Skycrawlers the film, they would need a young audience. When asking his daughter, the answer became clear. It would be a romance movie about young people. He was sure he could pull it off, and there was a fire in him. Fitter and emotionally stronger than ever, even if he was in his mid-50s. But he was still old, and his experience is mainly in making unk films, so he couldn't tackle this project alone. To speak to a younger generation, he'd need a young screenwriter. Chihiro Ito, only 23 at the time. She had worked on acclaimed Japanese dramas, but had no experience with anime. Lucky that's exactly what the director wanted. World building was the focus on many of the prior films. This time it would be around the characters first and foremost, to present young boys and girls who are neither heroes or villains, only as they are. Skycrawler's characters are children, a concept created in the novel, a group of genetically engineered, ageless soldiers who fight for nothing and who know nothing but the sky. Characters like Yuichi. They look like children and have only a vague sense of memories, but they have lived 100 lives. What would that do to you emotionally, and how do you cope with a life of nothing but endless war?
何やってんの？あんたたち。それは子供が乗るもんだよ。
一応俺も子供だけど。
Well, the absurdity doesn't seem to be lost on them, even if they do live in a kind of limbo, where the children just can't escape the blur of each operation. There's an alienation in their existence that others can't understand. It's represented in subtle ways, like how people outside the base speak different languages than the children, but the base is far away from society and they're isolated and bored, succumbing to their own melancholy. They're just doing whatever they can to forget the trauma. Yet, can you really forget the face of an old lover when they return from the grave? Kusanagi, the base commander, acts as though she's been waiting for the new recruit Yuichi for a long time. And while he's confused about it, he's still nonetheless drawn to her. When everyone else feels so alien, it's only another children who can really understand you. Thus, they're thrown into a fiery affair, a love triangle where the line between devotion and hatred is blurred. Yuichi and Kusanagi aren't good for each other, and yet they can't live without each other. It doesn't matter if they're only chasing ghosts. It's not rational, it's passionate and impulsive. The director wanted something that was going to hit the audience emotionally, a tragedy that would shock them to their core, like the kind of shock he felt when his longtime dog, Daniel, passed away.
もしかして君も殺してほしい。
The tone of its romance was inspired by the French film The Woman Next Door. It's this eloping, self-destructive relationship which can only end bleakly. So you could say the director's sense of love is quite pessimistic. This approach in physicality was new territory for the team, and to capture these emotions through animation wasn't going to be easy. Veteran Kisei was brought on to animate the more intimate moments, and it's lucky he agreed because he's been on record saying he'd never work with the director again. 20 years was just too many. Yet somehow he was convinced otherwise. How? Well, maybe it's easy to picture the director just throwing some sexy scenes at him to placate Kisei, but it was actually the animation director who convinced him in the end, Tetsuya Nishio. And this was the first time he was the sole animation director for Oshii. Oftentimes, Kisei would take that role, but he wouldn't return the director's calls. That being said, Nishio was in his prime, and under no uncertainty, without him, I don't think this movie could exist. Skycrawler's animation is full of character acting. Prior Oshii films set up the frame and removed movement as much as they could. letting the style fill in the blanks. Now they were told to do the opposite, to make things move even when nothing was happening. Subtle notions that would drive the in-betweeners mad. Not to mention, Skycrawlers had none of the same long monologues or lectures. If anything, it's eerily quiet, in these lonely locations where all you can focus on are these glances and gestures, subtle hints at a broader story that only become clear in further viewings. It's not always what is said, but what is left unsaid that tells us a lot about these characters. And to capture that, put a lot of expectation on the animators, opposed to the performers or the setting. Not to mention, some of these cuts are still really long, going on for minutes at a time, and the same animator would need to draw all that, 30 pages of storyboard to animate in full. To make that manageable for the animators, the animation director wanted to simplify the character designs for movement with few shadows and less lines. It was a new opportunity for him and the reason he took on the role, because he would have free reign to do what he wants with these character designs. If they look familiar, it's because Nishio is Mr. Naruto himself, who adapted the manga drawings to the anime. And while he had a lot of creative control on Skycrawlers, the director did have some specific requests.
In the summer of 2006, I was super busy with a certain Uzumaki feature film, but I also started the character designs for the Skycrawlers.
Well, I'll leave it to you. You're good at character designs, right?
Like the original novel's illustration, Suito has very short hair.
Bobbed hair! Suito usually wears a uniform, so her hair length is needed in order to show her femininity. Hair enables many picturesque shots, like hair blowing in the wind, or a woman pushing her hair back. My film won't work without bobbed hair. By the way, Suito wears titanium frame glasses and...
Geez. Okay. I got it.
To complete a film like this, they needed a team of 50 animators, many young, but new generation, and from outside the studio. In fact, a lot of the Production I.G veterans rejected the proposal flat out. The demands of an Oshii project are just becoming too much. The director even stated that there were few animators that could draw dogfights on the level he desired, which led to the decision, most likely, to use computer graphics for the film's aerial combat. Those scenes would take up a fourth of the runtime of the film. Sure, it's a romance at its core, but they still needed some action to keep the audience on the edge of their seats, and the director is a plane enthusiast, so he'd be quite strict on how the planes would be shown on screen, not only technically, but through its animation. They wanted to take Skycrawlers to the next level, to outdo even the works of Miyazaki. Oshii declared that he would beat the master at his own game. The CGI was created in collaboration with Polygon Pictures. They wanted to go beyond what was done in anime prior, to take advantage of 3D cameras and do things not possible in 2D animation, having the camera follow the action like it itself is participating in it. A different approach was taken on its choreography as well, as the mech designer storyboarded these dogfights. It was rare on an Oshii film because he usually storyboarded everything, but they needed someone with that technical knowledge and the skill to present the chaos of the battlefield to the CGI department. This is visceral to the point that it's even hard to follow what's happening at times. Who is friend or foe as you are bombarded by engines and explosions? You could say his sound is also half of this film. They were striving for accuracy and they went to the American studio Skywalker Ranch to do the sound design. They needed something just as intense as the visuals they've created, with these vibrant, dense soundscapes that overwhelm the audience, capturing each sound as realistically as they could, if it was planes or cars, and layering them in 6 channels of surround sound. It's almost like the sound design became a percussion for the original score, which was very light and dainty in comparison. It's one thing to have the sound and visuals mesh together, but within the visuals, there's still a question of how we're going to marry the two worlds of hand-drawn and computer animation. Each department was working closely together and tried to capture what they needed, especially with things like the cockpit scenes. That needed a lot of technical drawing, and there were no still frames this time, surrounded by flashing screens. These characters are moving a lot, and they're emoting. They want the audiences to feel for them, because at any moment it could be their last. Skycrawler sets itself up as a commentary on war, in another possible future where the world has eradicated war and attained some kind of peace, but this prolonged state of peace created a demand for a new type of war, a type that takes from Baudrillard's concept of hyperreality, real and unreal. It's almost like a Disneyland version of war, a virtualization of World War II set in a fake Europe. There are no victors, and there never will be. It's just a continuous Ouroboros that keeps going on. The bygone days of wars being fought by nations, they're long over. It is instead a war of private contractors, where war is but a sport to sponsor. There's no cause. Companies like Rostock shove their logos onto races just as much as death machines, and their motives, or even how they make financial profits, remain to be seen. In the Iraq War, it's said that about 20% of the combatants were hired by private firms, and Skycrawlers takes that concept to the natural endpoint. Yet the pilots here, they're treated like celebrities by the public. It reflects this idea of a clean war presented through the television, as a theatre for people to keep them placated. We rarely even see the casualties directly, as obscured through mechanical destruction or under cloth. The enemy as well is faceless without form, it's more of an idea. The only opponent mentioned by name is the teacher, and that's mainly because he used to work for their side, but even then we don't see their face. They might as well be a ghost. They're only personified by a beast-like cry on the battlefield. All the combatants are as disposable as the shell casings raining down. And the public may weep for them, but it's performative. They don't really value the children like people. They may as well be fictional to them, and that attitude only creates an animosity between these two groups.
Enough is enough! かわいそうなんかじゃない。かわいそうなんかじゃない。
The setting itself of a fake Europe is constructed from photos and the staff's own experience. They went scouting in Ireland, for example, so they created these paintings of wide open Celtic fields with scattered Neolithic stones. Although ultimately, they kind of exist just as a backdrop for these planes to fly over. And as much as each of these departments spends building up the reality they want, the elements will clash, almost intentionally so. The 2D designs simulate the works of prior anime. It's about teenagers thrust into the wars of adults. It sort of recalls some of the director's prior works, especially with the main character who was named Kusanagi after the Ghost in the Shell protagonist. And the design's not that far off, is it? Well, the 3D sections aimed for a type of unique realism, as close as you could get in 2008, I suppose. The staff went to say that they intentionally didn't try and merge these visuals either, so not to limit the potential of the CGI, so there's no cell shading or anything like that. The CG only clashes further with the clean animated characters. The episode director, Nishi Kubo, tried to make the aesthetic of this film more commercial when it comes to things like removing haze, making the image brighter. See, haze and distortion was used in the prior movies to unify the image and create sort of depth throughout the flat plane. But in Skycrawlers, that dissonance is on full display, and it only brings attention to the artificialness of the combat itself, splitting the film into two halves. In an interview with the director, he even argued that if he was to make a director's cut, he would cut out the aerial battles entirely. The events are separate enough that he sees them as unnecessary to show to the audience. And while it may have attempted to go towards realism, the aerial scenes are more reminiscent of a video game if anything, which does align itself with the virtualization of war that Baudrillard talks about in his book, The Gulf War Never Took Place. The world of screens made warfare into a video game, being no different than an arcade to the combatants, further compartmentalizing warfare. Even the children add into this notion because with each passing life, a new clone inherits their data like a memory card copying over save files. And when the enemy planes jump into slow motion, the destruction, it's almost garish. It's indistinct from something like Ace Combat. The Ace Combat team would actually go on to create a tie-in video game for the movie called Skycrawler's Innocent Sky, exclusively for the Wii of all consoles. The game doesn't even recount the movie, it's instead like a prequel with a new cast of characters, even having hand-drawn cutscenes by the studio Sebek. They use toon shaders for the planes, in contrast to the movie, so you do see what it could look like, and I suppose it doesn't have the same punch. But there is an interesting idea here within the story. In the game, your pilot rises through the ranks, becomes a squadron leader, and a legend on the battlefield. Known for their inhuman reactions, in part because of the game's unique mechanics, it gives your pilot like a distinct edge. But when you contrast that with the film, right, the rival pilot in the film is also known as the teacher and is an undefeated legend who resets the game when one side wins too much. At the end of the video game, it is actually revealed that your nameless character is in fact the teacher. You become the unattainable adversary by finishing the game, because it is you who wants to be entertained and continue the simulation. Hey everyone, let's just take a quick break for a second to thank my patrons and everyone watching. If you can like, you can comment, keep the series going, that would be great. YouTube is a very fickle beast and hard to sort of make work these days, so any support is great, especially the monetary ones. That keeps the lights on and keeps this production going. And without further ado, that is people like Secret of the Blue Water video, please, bruh. I think we've already done one. Anyway, and D-Fox, Gambaroni, Evan Reeves, Lloyd Miller, Lenny, Tim James Richards, Chunks, Fox Mulder, Paul, Steven's Mum, Systematic, Karen, Doji, Yegor, Vic Boss, DTB, Aleph, Mickey Moon, Pedro Ferreira, RG Palmer, Kitty Cat, Oscar Britton, Luger, Ian Laser, Curtis, Alexander Sofronoff, Axel GT, Sat, Ferry Curry, Mal, J Buck, and all my other patrons. Thank you very much, and let's get back to the video. And I'm sure that's all good, right? It makes for interesting comparisons and some insight into the possible philosophy of the film, but is that going to do anything for a general audience? Well, there does seem to be two wolves within the director, one who wants to do what the producer says and try and make a commercial movie, and the other one who's just kind of stuck in his ways. He's a director who boards things in an idiosyncratic way. You know, it's sparse on dialogue and it holds on long shots. It doesn't hide the dissonance between its 2D and 3D elements, as we've seen prior. When Nishi Kubo, the episode director, would suggest things to make it clearer to the audience, Oshii would be very stubborn and stand his ground. He wants it to be this way. And there were further tensions created by his kind of laid-back attitude throughout the production.
僕はなるべく遅くに入って早く帰る。僕はモットーなんだけど、前場に3時間以上いない。
Work-life balance is important, but you can't be the only one in the studio who can do it. Doesn't work then. Oshii spends a lot of time doing most of the storyboards, then checking the layouts and making sure all that stuff is fine. But after that sort of more intensive period is done, he is kind of loitering around for a while. The documentary staff had to create fake scenes of him doing stuff just so it looks like he was a director making decisions. They should have just asked Nishi Kubo to do it. If anyone's going to be real particular here, it is Nishi Kubo. If anything, you could look at Nishi Kubo as the day-to-day director of the studio. He compared Oshii to an architect where he is the floor manager, and he would be the person who would control how the final aesthetic image of the film looks. Oshii really did further rely on the production staff to make their own decisions when it came to lots of little details like, is this going to be CGI, is this going to be painted? Which he thought would not limit their creativity, but from a production standpoint it does create some issues where they kind of need to know what kind of production method they're doing for each part because they need to plan it around a schedule. And this schedule did get really tight towards the end. In fact, Nishio once said, I thought I might have died, where a lot of the staff were crunching and spending all their time in the studio for those last couple of weeks. And this is why you can feel there's a frustration in Nishio at the time, because he felt like out of the main staff members, he was the only one who really was enthusiastic about Skycrawlers.
Why is the director absent for 2 days a week at a karate dojo? Why does he go home every day at 6 p.m.? Why is he also shooting a live-action movie at the same time? Because of the bad precedent of finishing a film. I'm working very hard every day.
The animation director had a lot of work cut out for him, especially with the 50,000 drawings they needed to do to complete the movie. But at least he did have a lot of support from the veterans on the staff, like Inoue, to make sure it all came together in the end as best as they could. Because even if there isn't that much action in the movie, there were still shots that would be quite complicated and demanding. So with control also comes responsibility, and this was a real learning experience for Nishio, who felt a little frustrated that he couldn't get everything the way he wanted, but that's just how it goes. You have to work within the limits of the production. He was just glad that one day he could get the night train back with Oshii. If Skycrawlers sort of succeeds anywhere, it's in the small in-between moments. It's the cold night under the neon glow, floating in the sky, the things you can hold on to before you go back to the fray. Animation can also seem like an endless battle of endless every day to try and get to deadline, and in that way they're not that different than the children, I suppose. So then the question is really, did this actually find its audience in the end? Maybe younger people could relate to its comparison to modern Japan, and how you could look at it as quite similar to the sort of deaf game works that were very popular at that time. You know, the idea that young Japanese people were fighting to get into the best schools. They were trying to compete in a very stagnant job market, which was about to hit a market crash. And there's an interesting interview with Nishio, which I think kind of summarizes the end result, let's say.
After the first 5 minutes, I was thinking Oshii's style seems subtle here, or rather, going in a different direction. This could be something completely new.
But then after watching the rest of the film,
It was just regular old Oshii after all.
Skycrawlers may be a lot of things, you know, an art house romance with a kind of nuanced take on war, but it isn't necessarily commercial or beyond what you'd expect from Oshii. Even if it does change things a small bit, it can't deliver a completely new experience. And certainly it has a message which is quite gutsy, but it could also be seen by that young audience as talking down to them. Well, one essay by Gan pointed at a lot of disappointment that came with Skycrawlers, and that the slow pace coupled with the anticlimactic narrative that stresses the tedium of everyday life. So it could have left some fans confused or disappointed who were expecting maybe the well-paced action sequences of a Ghost in the Shell. It is no surprise that Skycrawlers did not sell 1 million tickets at the box office in Japan, so it wasn't a hit. It was released in 213 theatres, but only came 78th in terms of overall domestic box office, making about 700 million yen, which was only really reported in response to works like Summer Wars, which made twice as much as Skycrawlers at the box office. And I wouldn't say this is all on Oshii. I mean, Warner was the person promoting the picture, and I don't know if they did the best job of it in terms of, is Pizza Hut really the best way to promote Skycrawlers? I mean, it was the style at the time. But I don't think they really put as much emphasis on the international box office as they should, because Oshii's works can do a lot better in those areas. But I digress. The director did once joke that the book series kept getting more popular but his movie stayed the same. Although the film budget wasn't exactly as huge as, say, Innocence, it was about half of that. So not small, but it did eventually become a mild success. So you could definitely say this film is slept on, and you know what? I can understand it because I bought this film years ago on Blu-ray and I only opened it up recently to make this video, so I'm just as bad. But it's kind of hard to promote this type of movie, you know, it doesn't have that sort of instant hook. It's more kind of slow burn and sort of cerebral. You have to kind of think about it. Like, its appeal is more in its sleepy nature than it is in sort of an immediate explosion. Well, at the very least, Oshii has talked about his love for the movie and that he saw it almost as the maturity in his direction, which, considering some of the facts we brought up today, it's a bit of a strange way to look at it, but I do think it's a success in that sort of format. And hell, he even got some nice compliments from his contemporary anime directors. The first Oshii movie where I didn't fall asleep. It's good. Easy to understand. There are many Rei Ayanami-like characters that appear. It's Moe. So does that mean that Oshii's going to quit making films? Well, an interesting thing about that quote is that's how a lot of places were reporting the story, but they didn't actually give the full quote, which was something along the lines of, if this fails, I will quit making films this way and go back to my old ways. So maybe you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Though in a funny way, it's sort of true in that Oshii has not produced another 2D theatrical animation since Skycrawlers. So kind of a long time now, and some of that might have to do with the cost of making an animated movie has definitely went up in Japan as time went on, which might make it harder for him and his kind of niche projects to reimburse themselves. But also, there's so many different factors in terms of the layout crisis, brain drain, there's so many productions going on, it's going to be really hard to keep your talent together, and stuff like the home release is very much dying, and streaming does not reimburse creators in the same way, it doesn't give them the royalties they need to survive. So really, if Oshii wants to continue on, he may have to carve a new direction in this industry.
So animation movies in general, no matter how hard the director works, it cannot be materialized unless you have good animators.
So do you feel that maybe there's a bit of a lag, maybe even a dying in the industry? Is it slowing down?
そういう意味ではアニメーションの産業っていうのは低迷してきていると思いますか？
明らかに。
Definitely so.
That's super sad.
それはとても悲しい。